why do we have to pick a side, right? There's a lot of shared goals between both parties, which is economic growth, making sure the world doesn't boil over, and then feeding the people. There's some deep underlying shared basis for a good negotiation between both parties. I'm an optimist. I hope that we reach that consensus again at some point of time where everyone kind of figures out what that shared base is and actually have that proper negotiation. Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. Grain is an online restaurant that serves healthy yet tasty meals on demand and catering. They are backed by investors including the Lo and Behold Group, TEJia, Open Space, and Cento Ventures. Their meals are thoughtfully created by chefs with wholesome ingredients. For the month of April, Grain has teamed up with HGH Maimuna to bring you a quirky yet delightful experience for the first ever Michelin-inspired catering in Singapore. Learn more at www.grain.com.sg. If you ever need to feed your teams or family, go check out Grain. Morning, Shiyan.
Good morning, Jeremy.
I still can't believe you flew in so late last night and you're still pushing on.
It's my 3rd engagement this morning. Let's do it.
I know. I feel better. Like I didn't wake you up in the morning.
Coffee. Always coffee.
Oh, the secret. All those good flavonols and polyphenols to help you with that longevity. I like how coffee used to be one of those like good things that became a terrible thing. And then now it's a good thing again because it's antioxidants. So
I'll take it. Whatever it is, it helps me. So I'm not giving up coffee.
So we did get some listener feedback from our past episode, and we'll link to it in the transcript below about the TikTok ban and how it's come back 4 years later. So it was first proposed by Trump 4 years ago. Now Biden is looking at doing it. And then we had a debate about it and we had some listener feedback. So let me just summarize the 2 perspectives that the listeners had. The first is that they felt that it was not a nationalization. So they said that it is a divestment requirement, but the owner of this could be any non-CCP and non-China linked entity. In other words, I think they're saying that it may not be a nationalization, but it should be bought by somebody who's a non-Chinese buyer. So that potentially, for example, include the Saudis or the Europeans. So I think there's a larger ambit of that, or even a pure Singaporean company. So that's one argument of feedback.
Oh, someone proposed to me an alternative structure.
Oh yeah, go for it.
They said, look, OpenAI has already shown you the way. You can donate the business into a foundation.
Oh, and then let the foundation be purely run by the TikTok algorithm. That's going to be a nightmare. There's like Westworld, there's like an AI called Rehoboam. So that's how I create our AI overlord. It's like we divested Chinese algo to a self-independent algo. That's hilarious, actually.
Well, so it's not really owned by anyone. So you can save face, right? And it's a foundation. So I don't know. You could come up with creative ways to structure that.
You know what is even more terrifying than the idea of like X person controlling the levers of the algorithm to show a mirror to society is the idea of a perfect AI-driven mirror to society. That's like even worse. Because it's like
all those experiments with AI CEO, right? So you sort of say, okay, the entity sits inside a foundation. The AI CEO has these objectives and they set quarterly and annual goals and we all take our instructions from there.
No, that is truly a weapon of mass destruction there. I mean, is this saying like you already have these trust and safety teams all removing all kinds of content, right? But then you just give it to an AI. Like it's a perfect mirror to ourselves.
Just reinforces the worst parts of everyone.
Yeah, because there's so much control now. I mean, everybody's tuning their algos, right? I mean, we already removed the definition of extremist content, whatever the definition is, right? We remove gambling, depending on local jurisdictions. We've removed all kinds of pornography as well from the platform as well. So all that stuff is actually due to a political process, a law enforcement process, which feeds into your trust and safety teams in all of these social media platforms and Twitter and Facebook and so forth. So it'd be kind of interesting if you let it be truly independent, what it shows, I guess. Oh, I'll watch this.
You'd watch that movie? You'd watch that Netflix special?
I'll watch the
It's a reality TV. It'd be a reality TV series.
Reality TV. What happens? I just want to see so we just have a webcam into like what it outputs out. And then to see and then we see like dancing videos like climb 10x in the popularity stuff.
Sorry, it's just when you were, I just remember that feedback someone had given me, so I thought I would chime in, but
Yeah,
I
no,
don't
it's
mean to
totally fair.
derail you from the other feedback from our listeners on that episode.
And then the second piece of feedback that we got was that, hey, we missed out on the Jeff Yes angle. So the SIG investment angle, where he is a donor to the Trump campaign. He's also a large investor in TikTok. And he's also a large investor in the Truth Social SPAC by Donald Trump as well, or at least affiliated with him. So I think it's an interesting kind of identification that of an angle that I think from my side, I think we fairly didn't cover in our last episode.
Yeah, I mean, that is funny, right? Is that actually a big US fund is a financial beneficiary of the evil TikTok.
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is that a lot of US investors have invested in Chinese equities, whether at the market level or individual stock level. So I think Bridgewater, for example, Ray Dalio and his successor CEO was slammed for having invested in Chinese equities. And it's kind of a weird thing because there was a consensus that's okay to invest in Chinese equities for a long time. And then now everyone's kind of like putting on the pressure to say that, hey, that's a disqualifying attribute, whether that's on Reddit or on public politics, retail politics as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think also it's interesting that we're seeing this in how the funds are structuring themselves, right? So we already
Yeah.
had the separation of Sequoia China, Hongshan, and India, Peak
Yeah.
15 from the main Sequoia. GGV just announced the separation. And then I think there are a couple other big multinational funds are probably discussing this pretty intensely given sort of the sensitivities.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to note GGV, which has been a strong investor in the Southeast Asia ecosystem. So for the Asia partnership, it will be called Granite Asia, right? And the US partnership will be Notable Capital. And then the partners and the managing level has been split, right? So we have the Asia side, we have Jenny Lee and Jishin Fu, right? And it's going to be headquartered in Singapore, investing in APAC, including Southeast Asia, Japan, China, India, and Australia. And then the US partnership is Notable Capital and be led by the managing partners, Glenn Solomon, Hans Tong, Jeff Richards, and Oren Younger. So it'll be Silicon Valley based, headquartered with offices in San Francisco, New York, targeting US, Israel, Europe, and Latin America. So it's an interesting split that we're going to see is a big thing, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I think they felt like they needed to do that sort of proactively, right? Before somebody came after them to say, hey, why are you holding these assets? And I think we've also heard LPs have concerns about, am I going to have exposure? If I'm invested in some of these multi-region types of things, am I going to have political exposure? And so they're sort of trying to evaluate their risk there. But I think, Jeremy, we were just chatting earlier about like what does this trade war mean for people who are not American or Chinese? Do you have to pick a side?
Or Indonesians or Thai, or like most people in the world.
Yes, yes. If you're not in the 1.1 billion, was it 1.4 billion Chinese, or you're not in the 300 million Americans, if you're like the other 6 billion people, do you have to pick a side?
I used to speak at the Institute of Policy Studies back in 2000 and I think 15. I think I was speaking in Singapore. And actually at a panel discussion that we had, that was the biggest question I was asked was, hey, do we have to pick a side between the China and the US on the Singapore side, on the policy making side? And it's interesting because this question keeps resurfacing since 2015. And now it's become even, I don't know, the volume has gone up, right? I don't think it's at volume 10, but the dial's definitely at what, volume 6 maybe? I think it used to be at like a 1, right? And it's just been like clicking up by 1 dial every year. My short answer is, and it's the same as last time, is like, why? Why do we have to pick a side, right? I mean, I just think that there's a lot of shared goals between both parties, which is economic growth, making sure the world doesn't boil over, and then feeding the people. So I think there's some like deep underlying shared basis for a good negotiation between both parties. And it just feels like we're just not getting there, and we kind of lost that consensus. And I think I'm an optimist. I hope that we reach that consensus again at some point of time where everyone kind of figures out what that shared base is and actually have that proper negotiation. But yeah, I think right now, I think people are being forced to pick sides. In fact, I just had a young tech operator and he was basically saying that, hey, he felt that if he chose to work at a Chinese company that's headquartered in Singapore, that he would be disqualified from working at an American company later down. And I was like, I mean, like you said, what's interesting is that whether it's
The
true
people
or
are
not,
asking the question.
exactly, because people feel that. They feel that pressure. And I was like, and I think what I said to him is, I do believe that if you work at, for example, an executive as at a key Chinese company in a sensitive area like social media, for example, I think it would be pretty difficult for you to work in an American company. That's my belief. But I think it's less sensitive if it's like a more like B2B or more back office kind of transfer. I think that's one. But two, also, I think that it probably also doesn't matter as much for junior folks. And also, I think it's a little bit one directional. That's my sensation. I don't know whether it's true or not, but I think the concern is primarily if you work at a Chinese company, at an American company. But I do think that if you work at an American link company and you choose to work for a Chinese company, I think that's still a doable move. So that's my point of view.
I think the challenge would probably be more cultural.
Yeah. And how many people actually had the experience? I mean, of having done both, right? I think JX Lai, right? He's the founder of Acme, former chief product officer. There was a former guest on the podcast, which we'll link to in the link below. But he's one of the few people who worked at both Dropbox and Lyft, as well as ByteDance, right? And so very few people in the world have actually kind of like crossed or done both sides.
Yeah. It's interesting. It'll be a continuing conversation.
What do you think? I mean, you asked me what I think. I'm just kind of curious.
I don't know. I mean, I think that, like, I suspect the barrier is much more cultural than, well, there's now a blacklist. And if you've worked at any of these companies, we're not going to hire from them. But I do think that if the political temperature continues to increase, then I think for more senior roles, there'll be more scrutiny, and that will be a consideration. But yeah, interesting times we live in.
That actually brings up a good point, which is that recently the Yusof ISEAS Institute in Singapore recently just did a survey of Southeast Asia. And so basically they asked Southeast Asians if ASEAN, which is the geopolitical association for Southeast Asia, had to pick sides. And they had to pick between China and US. For the first time ever, since this question was being asked since 2020, the majority of respondents now opt for China. So 50.5% would opt for China and 49.5% would prefer the US if ASEAN had to pick sides, which is fascinating. Just came out. And obviously, I think it's a reflection of Southeast Asia, right? Which is that it's pretty much 50-50 split right now. It has been quite close to that for some time. But now, obviously, every paper is hyperventilating that Southeast Asians would pick China more. I mean, 50.5% is a very small number, right?
I guess, what does that mean, though? What does it mean to pick China? I think a lot of people's experience of China is the investments they do in their countries. I think through the sort of previous Belt and Road type of stuff. Whereas I think a lot of people's experience of the US is less that and possibly more sort of cultural exposure, media, entertainment, music, even like speaking English. I mean, I don't know. I think it's like an interesting, everyone wants to be their own sovereign country, right? Nobody wants to be like a vassal state. So it's like an interesting question of like, I don't know, maybe there's like only small countries. It's just like, well, what does it mean to pick sides? Because there's obviously things that you can like and dislike about both countries' policies.
So let's kind of like rattle off some of the numbers. So the Philippines and Vietnam were about 80% would prefer the US. Singapore was about 60% are preferring for the US, as well as Myanmar and Cambodia. And then after that, you had Thailand, which is about 50-50. And then you had Brunei, Laos, Indonesia, and Malaysia, which generally preferred US for around the 20 to 30% range. So kind of like in a stack rank of like US affiliation being higher would be Philippines, then the Vietnamese, then the Singaporeans, then the Myanmarese, then the Cambodians, then the Thais, then the Bruneians, Laos, then the Indonesia, then Malaysia. So there's an interesting stack rank. And just to throw in one more number is that similar to what you said is most people don't want to pick sides, but only 8% wanted to choose, whereas 47% basically said that ASEAN should be independent and resist pressure from both the US and China. So the vast majority actually don't want to pick sides either, as you said. But if they had to pick sides, that would be the stack rank of numbers. And we'll insert this chart into the podcast and the transcript.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. Okay. On to less political topics, Turbi.
So yeah, circling back to Granite Asia. So I think there are two interesting facts about it. First of all, they had built out an advisory council to guide expansion, which included Thomas Ng, a GGV founding partner, Tay Kok Ping, a former GIC president for special investments, and Teo Ming Kien, the former chairman of Singapore's National Science and Technology Board. So I think quite an interesting vector of folks that'll be an advisory council. The second part of that strategy is that they are looking at exploring private hybrid funding, which is a mixture of both equity and debt, and they want to use that capital to basically explore that different financing structure than what we have historically seen in Southeast Asia, right? Which is pure equity and some debt, I think, in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think it'll be good. I think having their center be in Singapore, and obviously a lot of Singapore connections between Jenny and Jisun. So I think that's all really good for the region.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that we're seeing more debt as well. I think a lot of folks I've met are really looking at debt as an instrument for a couple of different reasons, right? But I think the big one is just that for some of the growth trajectories of the companies, debt might be a better structure in terms of cost of capital to drive returns, but also get something back as well in various outcomes.
And also because banks are so conservative in the region. And so I think there is really room for private credit. I think the private credit market here is so much shallower than what you have in the US. And so that actually really limits a lot of the growth channels. You're forced to take pretty expensive equity when I do think debt is a more appropriate instrument in some situations.
I think that the CFOs in Southeast Asia have less experience in debt, I would say as well. Obviously, the CFO field is a little bit less mature compared to the US, but the set of relationships you need to have to access debt, the trust relationships that you need to have, but also how to think through the equity and debt capital stack. I think that does feel like it's an area for improvement for Southeast Asian CFOs from my perspective.
But I mean, also, we just don't have that many companies at scale that could take on some of these structures. And so
You need to be
hopefully
profitable.
that will come to pass. Yeah, either that or you have some heavy equipment to collateralize against, which is also not very common for startups.
Or you have IP, I think, at least some sort of like real IP that has some sort of license rights as well. So yeah, so I think it's an interesting dynamic, but it's kind of like chicken and egg, right? I think as the more VC funds do more debt, I think we'll see people kind of get smarter about it. But I think it's an interesting instrument that we'll see more of, not less in the future, which is interesting.
For sure.
So we had an interesting article about why is it so hard for bike sharing companies to survive in Singapore. So we had SG Bike exited, and then they had to hand over all their bikes and customers to their competitors.
It is funny, right? Because actually, I think that Singapore is ideal for biking in some sense because it's so flat, but the weather works against you, I think, is one piece of it. But I actually think that can be solved with the electric ones, so you don't have to expend as much energy. But also, I think in most of the cities where you've seen the bike stuff really take off, there is public-private partnership. So in New York, for example, where the program is used very extensively, Citi is the partner there. Their branding is on all the bikes, but the program is actually run by Lyft. And so I think that helps the program stay afloat. But it is sort of like you have to believe there is a non-financial benefit to the program, which is one, of course, like there's advertising for the partner, but it's also like lowering the number of cars, reducing pollution, increase exercise for the population, et cetera, et cetera. But as a pure financial proposition, I think it's pretty challenging. And I think if you remember when they did the crackdowns on the scooters, they made it really hard to like, oh, you have to park in this specific place. It's like, well, there's no bike lane. It can't be on the sidewalk. There's like pedestrians there. And so I think we actually need to do more there. It does seem like N Parks is doing a bunch on the bike routes, though, if you look at some of the new routes that they've opened up. And I do know people who live on the east side, they have a very nice bike commute into town. And it's protected. You're not on the road. There's enough space. You're not fighting with pedestrians either. And so I think actually if you could have more of that, that would be great. And I do know they put a lot of bike parking around MRT stations so that people can do kind of like bike the MRT station and then take MRT in. But I don't think Singapore is that bike friendly yet.
Yeah, like you said, it's really hot, it's rainy. And actually, honestly, bikes are pretty cheap, right? So if you live and you know your route, putting a bike lock is there. So I think it's interesting, like you said, the macro factors of like how flat, how much the government is pushing for more cycling infrastructure, and the fact that most Singaporeans bike for fun. I mean, there's a lot of good macros. I find it also quite interesting because Any Wheel is now the market leader and is the only operator that really didn't take any venture capital funding.
Last man standing.
Last man standing, bootstrap, cash efficiency. They beat Mobike, I don't remember, and Obike, and Ofo. Like those were like the massive VC funded ones. Those were like dramatic boom and bust, leave their bikes everywhere kind of thing. So it's interesting that this homegrown company that didn't take venture capital won the VC funded mobility wars. I mean, we saw Lime out in the US, we saw Bird, for example. Those were kind of like pioneered the first generation of last mile mobility companies.
Yeah. But I mean, I think in general, it is good, right? I would encourage more bike commuting. Even with the electric bike, I think what they've shown is that people who do bike actually, they get more exercise than they would have otherwise if it didn't exist. And so I think those are all net positive. And there's all this stuff about Singapore being like a blue zone. And a big part of the blue zone sort of characteristics is that people move their bodies in regular life. It's not just about going to the gym, but there's enough in their daily activity. I just got back from Tokyo. I mean, people talk about how Japan is such an aged country, but all those old people are walking around. They're taking the subway, and it's not disability friendly, I would say. There's a lot of stairs. There's not always an escalator. You have to walk quite far sometimes to transfer between trains. But, I think that daily activity actually really helps people at a population scale level. So it was just interesting to see that.
What it reminded me of is at the end of the day, we're down to 2 players left in the market. So there's them, and then there's a Chinese new entrant, which only has 10,000 bikes. So I feel like this market by nature has that like network effects. I don't know what you call it, or coverage area, whatever that thing that gets VCs very excited to be like, hey, there's some economies of scale. Like this market should not be fragmented across 10 different players. It will eventually consolidate to 1 or 2. But I think what's interesting is that it's the non-VC funded bootstrap one that got there to the end, because normally that slide is used to argue that you should VC fund it. and then you need to blitzscale and you need to swarm the market in order to become the last man standing.
I think blitzscaling is probably not as popular as it used to be. And so, I mean, I think at least if you look at the results for the last 5 years, right? I think the people who blitzscaled, there are not that many ultimate winners. I think a lot of people just set a lot of money on fire.
Yeah, I mean, we're also kind of like a little bit unfair to the author of Blitzscaling because he implied that there was a very strong requirement of positive unit economics before you blitzscale. But then everybody kind of said the public markets are going to reward a cash burning business at the end. So therefore, why don't we just make it negative blitzscaling? The unit economics are not fixed yet. We'll blitzscale first to get and kill and become the last man standing, and then we'll switch on to profitability, monopoly profits afterwards, which is interesting. I don't know. I thought this was just an interesting microcosm of the entire debate that we've had multiple times about the right capital/growth approach.
I don't know. I always tell founders that they only have 3 jobs, but number 1 job is don't run out of money. And one way of not running out of money is like, hey, you're really good at raising money. But the other way of not running out of money is like you have a sustainable business. So obviously we're not in our zero interest rate environment anymore. But I think depending on who you are, like you can't drink your own Kool-Aid, right? If you're running the fundraising game, then there is an endpoint to it. The music does stop at some point. And so hopefully you took advantage of all that cheap capital and built something that was like really great and sustainable, and you didn't drink too much of your own Kool-Aid.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting. I think, do you think the CCCS of Singapore, the competition authority, is going to be like, oh, we see that there's no more competition left because Any Wheel has 30,000 bikes plus SG Bike, probably, I don't know what the total end quantum is. So maybe it's 40 or 50 or 60,000. I guess the Chinese company Hello Ride has the license to operate up to 10,000, but it's pretty like the Uber Lyft dynamic or the Grab Uber or Gojek Grab kind of like choke out. Just like you pretty much have 80% share, you have the returns of, you have the market size domination, then it can gives you the profitability margin.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think they'll probably want to see kind of how it plays out because I don't think you want no players.
Yeah, exactly. So it turns out like 3 players is unsustainable for unit economics unless you're really, really well run or very, very patient.
But I am curious, who are the users, right? Because to your point that a bike is not that expensive. And so I think I rented a bike maybe when they first all showed up because I was kind of just curious, but I haven't actually rented a bike. Whereas in contrast, whenever I go to New York, I actually use City Bike quite a lot because it's integrated into my Lyft app. And sometimes that's just like the fastest way to get someplace because you don't want to switch trains. It's not on a direct subway line. And you're like, okay, I'm going to bike 25 blocks. And that actually is the fastest way to get someplace. So I am curious because I've seen them more in like residential estates increasingly, and then also like light industrial areas where maybe there are buses, but the buses don't come as frequently. And so people would rather ride out to their job or whatever it is. But I'm curious actually who the user base is.
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's the tourist side. I've already seen folks there. I guess if you are, I don't know actually. This is something maybe, why don't we reach out to the CEO and say, hey, can you come on and do an interview and talk about how you survived? I think it'd be a fun one.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. Inside baseball.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like a microcosm of everything we talked about, right? We're just like, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And how do you like do that? Because we've seen actually a lot of mobility companies really go through that boom and bust cycle, right? I remember Lime and Bud used to be huge. And then now they're like,
Lime is
so
still
small.
doing pretty well.
Yeah,
I think
Bird is the one.
Bird had a lot of challenges.
But I think Lime is also no longer as big. It's like it used to be like the way of the future. And now it's like.
But I think they survived. And I think if I recall correctly, their biggest markets are in Europe because European cities are kind of like more, they're flat. They're more designed for this kind of commuting traffic.
For my Europe travel, sounds perfect. I'm just like,
right?
Yeah.
You fit in with all the other Dutch people.
No, the Dutch people have such nice bikes. I think mine is going to be like branded in some garish orange or yellow or green color. They're those little nice European, ones that stand upright and then a little like basket in front, like a wicker basket. And then inside there's a bunch of fruit and I don't know.
I want the one, the wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow one, where you put your kids in front.
I know. I always want to be like those cycling dads that cycles my kid to school.
You can. Your children are still small enough. Mine are too big. I think it'd be too heavy to cycle them.
I know. But then I'm getting complaints from the wife about, it's like, oh, it's unsafe. And I'm like.
But see, that's the thing, right? Which is that I actually think that Singapore is not actually that designed for biking.
It's designed for recreational biking, but not for bike commuting, which is I think the biggest driver, if I was to say, for this kind of bikes. It's you commute, right? Because you go from point A to point B. Well, I'm sure some people do, but in that case, then you might as well buy a bike, right? So that's, and I think also public safety is a big part, actually, if I were to say one thing as well. If you have your own bike and then you park it at a MRT, you have your own public safety, like you don't think it's gonna get stolen. You use your own bike, right?
Yeah. Although I was also thinking whether density was an issue, but in Japan, in Tokyo, there actually were a lot of bikers.
Yeah.
I mean, the weather's better, and there were protected bike lanes. actually. No, they weren't protected, but they were like section. Yeah, they were protected bike lanes. So you
Yeah,
definitely
yeah.
saw more bikers than you do in Singapore. And there's high public safety there as well. So yeah. Anyway,
In other news, Terence Zhou, the founder of Ride, announced on LinkedIn that he said that he is proud to have made history as the first Singapore ride-hailing company to IPO on the New York Stock Exchange.
it's an interesting choice. I think is trading at like a 60 million market cap. So definitely in the sort of realm of micro cap public companies. We talked about Oh My Home going public last year and on NASDAQ, and I looked up the numbers there and it's trading at a 20 million market cap. And so it's kind of curious to me. I mean, obviously it's great to get liquidity in any format in this environment for investors. But I think some of the benefits of being public may be more muted because there are compliance requirements and reporting requirements that are actually like non-trivial that you have to do when you're publicly traded. And as a microcap, you don't get a lot of research coverage because there's a limit to how many stocks analysts can cover. And if you don't get coverage, then it's hard to kind of get some bigger institutional holders. So yeah, it's a curious move.
Yeah, and I also have to say that it was a very intentional choice of words, right? Because they said that they're the first to IPO on the New York Stock Exchange, whereas Grab, the market leader in Singapore, went on the NASDAQ and they went through the SPAC process, right? Back in 2020 and 2021, which was then the largest foreign SPAC to ever happen during that time. And I think that record is probably going to stand for quite some time now in this bear market. But I'm mentioning it just because I think people will want to make sure that I am contrasting that properly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and there's a bunch of I think sort of growth stage companies that are probably looking to the IPO process. I think Dershing put out a post on Caro, kind of like running through the numbers. And I think they're in a bit of a different situation. I mean, I think they have 180 million in cash still, so they're in no rush. I think, and really trying to get the business in tip top shape before going public, and that I think would be a bigger thing.
Yeah, I think Dershing's article, which you also linked to in the transcript, was a really great breakdown from his perspective. Again, I think it just goes to show that there isn't much independent financial analysis, I would say, of public reports, and I'm really glad that he's writing. So I think he's going to be a recurring feature in our podcast. But basically, he went to look at the end of March 2023 numbers, and basically, quote unquote, he felt that now they are effectively a car dealer plus car marketplace plus financing companies with some extras thrown in like selling ads and insurance. So he felt like at the end of the day, it's a nice synergistic business on a financing and marketplace where 1 + 1 equals 2.5 plus.
Oh, 2.5 plus. Sorry, I was like 1.1 equals 2.5 plus what?
Well, he was just saying that it wasn't. I think he was contrasting it to saying it's not 1 + 1 = 5 or 10, which is what the dream would be
Oh, sorry,
for
got it.
tech IPO. So this is a 2.5 plus business. Yeah. So I think some key points he was just saying was that, hey, the Carvana stock, which is a key benchmark, has rebounded and Carvana is profitable and trading at 13, 14 times EBITDA. Whereas Caro hasn't hit there yet, still loss making overall. It's making 5 million in 2023, growing to 30 to 40 million in FY 2024, and still loss making with minus $98 million in FY 2023, right? Which means that from his perspective, 2024 should show narrowing losses, but still be a net loss. So he thinks that from his perspective is that Caro will be valued at 7 to 10 times EBITDA because of smaller size and loss making, which means that it's probably worth 300 to 400 million currently from his perspective. And which is, yeah. And he felt like that as a result, that would be about 60 to 80% discount off the last round for Caro in terms of valuation.
Yeah, they got to grow into their valuation.
I think this is a common story for a lot of Asian growth companies, I would say, where they have to grow into the valuations.
Well, I mean, I think we talked about the decoupling of local regional investors versus the international investors that have been driving some of the headier numbers at the growth end of the spectrum. And so I think in this next cycle, perhaps we'll see some more measured valuation upticks for companies that are just growing up now.
Yeah, I think that's the tricky part is the early investors are still making money in the ecosystem because you're not paying the pricing risk. Of course, they get diluted a lot more than they would have thought they would have had. But at the end of the day, if it hits the finish line, it's a finish line, right? It's just that I think Southeast Asia, the growth stage investors have not done so well.
Yeah.
So what's the mantra for the week, Shiyan?
The mantra for the week?
Yeah, what this week, any words for intentionality?
No, I just came back from a week of meetings in Seoul and Tokyo, and I'm headed to Hong Kong tomorrow for another set of meetings. And I was just reflecting on it and thinking like how lucky we are really to get to do the work and these people who are fired up about startups and innovation and really wanting to do more in that space. So yeah, maybe can gratitude be a mantra? I don't know. I'm not a mantra expert, but like I'm feeling, you want to be grateful and feel that gratitude because it's been we're so lucky.
Yeah, amazing. I think on my end, I think the word that comes to mind is intentionality. So trying to be a bit more intentional about some of the choices I have to make rather than reflexive. So I think that's something that I felt like the past few days I've just been like move, flow, do. And now I'm like, okay, I think this is something to do next week.
That's good. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. On that note, see ya.
Thanks, Jeremy. See ya.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.